photograph taken on Mustique in the mid-1970s. The princess is in a long caftan, sun-bleached and slightly creased at the hem, a cigarette holder between two fingers, the light coming in low across the terrace. Her hair is pinned up against the heat. Behind her, the Caribbean is the colour of a swimming pool. She is looking at someone outside the frame, and whatever she is being told appears to amuse her. The rumour attached to that week, repeated for half a century in memoirs and biographies and the quieter sort of London dinner conversation, is that Mick Jagger was on the island, that a car was sent from Les Joliot down to the small airstrip, that the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, then the most photographed musician on earth, was driven up the hill to the princess's villa and stayed for a length of time that no one in service would later specify. Whether that drive ever happened, whether the man got out of the car, whether anything occurred between them on that island, or in London, or in New York across the 15 years they knew one another, is the question. It has been the question since 1993, when an American biographer named Christopher Anderson published a book called Jagger, Unauthorized, and stated in print and without qualification that the Queen's sister and the frontman of the Rolling Stones had been lovers. Anderson had sources. He had been told. He insisted he knew. Other biographers, working later, with longer access and cooler tempers, have concluded that he did not know, that what passed between Princess Margaret and Mick Jagger was a flirtation, a long mutual fascination, a friendship the palace would not describe, but not, in the end, an affair. The British biographer Philip Norman, whose 2012 book, Mick Jagger, remains the most thorough account of the singer's private life, examined the same evidence and arrived at the opposite verdict. Two reputable writers, the same archive of photographs, the same overlapping guest lists, the same whispered anecdotes from the same Caribbean staff. Two opposite conclusions. And at the centre of it, a woman who lived another 26 years after the rumour first surfaced, and never, in public or in private correspondence, confirmed or denied a single line of it. To understand why the question still matters, it is necessary to understand the size of the gap it would have closed. Princess Margaret was born on the 21st of August 1930, second in line to the throne of the United Kingdom at the moment of her birth. She was the spare, in the cold modern vocabulary, to her elder sister Elizabeth, and from childhood she was raised inside the particular pressure of being almost, but not quite, the centre of the constitutional arrangement. Mick Jagger, born Michael Philip Jagger on the 26th of July 1943, was the son of a physical education teacher from Dartford in Kent. By 1969, he was the most photographed rock musician on earth. By the standards of the world, both of them had been born into, a confirmed liaison between them would have detonated something. It would have collapsed in a single tabloid headline, the careful distance the House of Windsor maintained from the counterculture that had grown up around it. Margaret had been the family's romantic problem from the start. In the early 1950s, she had fallen in love with group captain Peter Townsend, a divorced equerry 16 years her senior, and the question of whether she could marry him had occupied the cabinet, the church, and the front pages for the better part of 2 years. She could not. She did not. By 1955, the affair was over, and Margaret emerged from it as a figure the British press would never again leave alone. In 1960, she married the photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, ennobled for the occasion as Lord Snowdon. He was the first commoner in 400 years to marry into the immediate royal family. He was also, crucially, a working photographer of the New London, a man whose professional life ran through the studios and the nightclubs and the recording sessions of the decade that was about to begin. That marriage gave Margaret a passport into a world that no previous member of the royal family had inhabited. By the late 1960s, apartment 1A at Kensington Palace, the 4-story residence she shared with Snowdon, had become a kind of salon. Actors, dancers, photographers, designers, musicians moved through it. The lady-in-waiting Anne Len Connor, whose memoir Lady-in-Waiting was published in 2019, describes a constant traffic of artists and the deliberate, almost defiant pleasure Margaret took in the unconventional company. She liked people who made things. She liked people who told her things she had not been told before. The court, watching from a careful distance, did not always approve. Jagger, by the same point, had begun his own social climb. He had been educated at the London School of Economics. He was, in private, mannered, careful with money, more middle class than the snarling figure on the stage suggested. In February 1967, he and Keith Richards had been arrested at Richards's house in Sussex, Redlands, in a drug raid that resulted in prison sentences and a famous editorial in The Times by William Rees-Mogg, asking who would break a butterfly upon a wheel. The Redlands bust turned Jagger, briefly and usefully, into a class war symbol. It also marked the moment at which he began to be received in the houses of the English upper class as something other than an entertainer. By 1968, he was living at number 48 Cheyne Walk in Chelsea, a Queen Anne house on the river, less than 2 miles from Kensington Palace. There is a documented earlier overlap. In 1964, the Princess and Lord Snowdon attended a Rolling Stones performance. Snowdon, professionally embedded in the New London, would naturally have moved in those circles, and his wife went with him. It is the first time the two names appear in the same room in the public record. They were introduced, presumably. They would have said something polite. Jagger was 21. Margaret was 33, a princess of the blood, the sister of the reigning monarch, and a woman who had already learned that her interest in a man could become, within a week, a national emergency. What can be said for certain is that by the end of the 1960s, they were no longer strangers. The geography had begun to close. The Cheyne Walk house was on Margaret's side of London. The Kensington Palace set had begun to include musicians as a matter of course. Snowdon photographed Jagger. Mutual friends arranged the dinners. The decade that had begun with a princess in the back of a Rolls-Royce and a Dartford grammar school boy in a recording studio was ending with both of them, increasingly, in the same rooms. They were moving in overlapping circles in a London that had begun to dissolve the old barriers, and the first specific anecdote of their contact, the one that begins to put them at the same table, is about to be told. By the end of the 1960s, Margaret and Jagger were no longer strangers. They were moving through overlapping rooms in a London that had begun to dissolve its old barriers. And the first specific anecdote of their contact belongs to the spring of 1967. In February of that year, the Sussex police raided Keith Richards's country house at Redlands. Jagger was found with 4 amphetamine tablets bought legally in Italy. Richards was charged with allowing his property to be used for the smoking of cannabis. By the end of June, Jagger had been sentenced to 3 months in prison, Richards to a year. The sentences were so disproportionate that The Times, under the editorship of William Rees-Mogg, ran a leading article on the 1st of July titled, "Who Breaks a Butterfly Upon a Wheel?" It is remembered as one of the most consequential newspaper editorials of the post-war period. Within days, the sentences were overturned on appeal. What is less remembered is the reaction inside Kensington Palace. According to Christopher Anderson's account, and corroborated in fragments by other writers of the period, Princess Margaret spoke privately about the case to friends and described the sentences as absurd. The sympathy is not as surprising as it might first appear. Her brother-in-law, Lord Snowdon, had already photographed Jagger for a magazine commission. The social bridge between apartment 1A and Cheyne Walk had been laid down by Snowdon's own camera. Margaret knew who Jagger was. She knew the music. She had attended a Rolling Stones performance with her husband 3 years earlier. When the establishment came down on a young man she had watched perform, she did not side instinctively with the establishment. That in itself was telling. The second anecdote belongs to the early 1970s and to a particular Chelsea address. Jagger had bought the house at 48 Cheyne Walk in 1968. It sat on the embankment, 3 stories of Queen Anne brickwork facing the Thames, and by the time of his marriage to Bianca de Macias in May 1971, it had become one of the most photographed front doors in London. The interior, by every surviving account, was Moroccan in mood. Low cushions, brass lanterns, the smell of jasmine and tobacco, a hi-fi on the floor. Philip Norman's 2012 biography records that Princess Margaret attended at least 2 dinners at Cheyne Walk during this period. On one occasion, she was seated beside Jagger himself. Picture the room. A duke's daughter on one side, a baronet's heir on another, an American film actress somewhere near the fire, and at the head of the table, a 30-year-old singer from Dartford talking to the Queen's sister about, by various accounts, the Italian Renaissance, ballet, and a mutual acquaintance who had recently behaved badly in Tangier. The conversation was reportedly easy. They had read the same books. They knew the same people. They smoked the same brand of cigarette. That detail of social ease matters because it sets up the third location, the one where the friendship deepened past the reach of London witnesses. The Caribbean island of Mustique had been bought in 1958 by Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, for £45,000. As a wedding gift to Margaret in 1960, Tennant offered her a choice between a silver dish and a plot of land on his island. She chose the land. For more than a decade, the plot sat undeveloped, while Tennant turned Mustique from a malarial outpost into a private playground for people who could not, in any other location, be unguarded in public. Margaret's villa, Les Jolies Hauts, designed by her uncle Oliver Messel, was finally completed in 1973. What Mustique offered her was something she had not possessed since childhood, a place where the rules of British public life simply did not apply. There were no photographers on the island. There was no press boat. The staff signed nothing because they had not been asked to. Anne Glenconner, who served as Margaret's lady-in-waiting for 30 years and published her memoir, Lady-in-Waiting, in 2019, describes Mustique evenings of barefoot dinners at Basil's bar, of long swims at dawn, of conversation that ran past 3 in the morning because nobody had anywhere to be. By the mid-1970s, Jagger had bought property on the same island. The visits overlapped. Glenconner's memoir places Margaret and Jagger at the same Mustique tables on more than one occasion, often hosted by Tennant himself, who delighted in seating princesses next to guitarists and watching what happened. The terrace at Les Jolies Hauts faced the sea. The staff went home at 10. What was said there belongs to a list of conversations that history will not recover. Then came February 1976, and the third anecdote, which is the one that detonated everything. A photographer working for the News of the World, lying in scrub on a Mustique hillside with a long lens, captured Margaret in a swimsuit on a beach with a young man named Roddy Llewellyn. Llewellyn was 28. Margaret was 45. He had been introduced to her in 1973 at a house party in Scotland, and the relationship, conducted largely in private, had become the open secret of her circle. When the photographs ran in the British press, the Snowdon marriage, which had been hollow for years, finished overnight. Separation was announced on the 19th of March, 1976. The divorce was finalised in May 1978, the first divorce of a senior royal since Henry VIII. In the aftermath, every Fleet Street picture desk began trawling back through a decade of Margaret's social engagements. Every man she had been photographed beside became a question. Lovers were proposed and discarded by the week. Among the names that surfaced and refused to go away was Mick Jagger's. This is where the biographer's claim enters the record. Christopher Anderson, an American writer with a long career in celebrity biography, published Jagger, Unauthorized, in 1993. The book asserts, without hedging, that Margaret and Jagger had a sexual relationship during the early to mid-1970s. Anderson cites sources within Jagger's circle, whom he does not name. He describes the affair as one driven on Jagger's side by fascination, the social climber's ultimate trophy, the daughter of George VI in his bed. And on Margaret's side, he suggests, by the appetite of a woman who had spent her entire life being told what she was not permitted to have. The book caused a brief sensation when it appeared. The palace did not respond. Margaret did not respond. Jagger did not respond. The story circulated, was picked up by the tabloids, was repeated in profile pieces for another decade, and gradually settled into the strange half-life of celebrity rumour, neither confirmed nor refuted, simply present. The counterweight arrived 19 years later. Philip Norman, a British biographer with a long pedigree in rock writing, having previously produced major lives of John Lennon and the Beatles as a whole, published Mick Jagger in 2012. Norman went over the same ground Anderson had walked. He interviewed many of the same survivors, by then nearly 2 decades older, and he reached a different conclusion. The relationship between Margaret and Jagger, Norman writes, was almost certainly a deep flirtation and a genuine social friendship, but not a sexual affair. His reasoning is practical rather than moralistic. The geometries of the period, he points out, do not align. Margaret in the mid-1970s was wholly absorbed by Roddy Llewellyn, the relationship that would cost her the marriage. Jagger was newly married to Bianca, a marriage that was already strained, but which was being conducted under intense public attention. The windows of opportunity that Anderson's account requires were, Norman suggests, narrower than they appear at a distance. Norman also makes a point about the nature of Jagger's social ambition. A real affair with Margaret would have been, for Jagger, something he could not have resisted boasting about, however discreetly. The boast would have leaked. The leak would have surfaced in the press of the late 1970s, when Margaret's private life was being filleted weekly. It did not surface in the press of that period. It surfaced only later, in a single American biography, sourced to people who would not put their names to it. So the contradiction sits in plain view. 2 reputable biographers, the same archive of anecdote and photograph and witness testimony. Anderson says yes. Norman says probably not. The witnesses they interviewed overlap. The places they describe overlap. The conclusion does not. And Margaret herself, who lived another quarter of a century after the Mustique photographs ran, who survived the divorce, who outlived her own scandal cycle, and became, in old age, a figure of slightly faded eccentricity rather than active controversy, never once said which of them was right. The contradiction sits in plain view. Two reputable biographers, working from substantially the same archive of anecdote and photograph, reach opposite conclusions. And Princess Margaret herself, who lived another quarter century after the events in question, never once said which of them was right. To make any progress, the evidence has to be examined piece by piece, and the sourcing behind each claim weighed against what the people closest to the story actually went on the record to say. Christopher Anderson's case rests on a particular network of sources. For Jagger Unauthorized, public in 1993, Anderson drew on associates of Jagger from two overlapping worlds: the Cheney Walk circle of the early 1970s and the New York scene of the later 1970s, when Jagger and Bianca had become fixtures at Studio 54. Margaret was seen at the same club in 1977 and again in 1978, escorted at various points by figures from the fashion and theatre worlds who moved easily between Manhattan nightlife and Kensington Palace. Andy Warhol's diaries, published in 1989 after his death, record Margaret and Jagger at the same gatherings in New York, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in the larger throng that Warhol catalogued with his habitual deadpan precision. The two were not strangers in that city, and they were not strangers in London, and they were not strangers on Mustique. That much is firm. The specific Anderson claim goes further. Anderson writes that Jagger boasted privately to friends about the relationship, and that he treated the conquest as something different in kind from his other liaisons. One source, unnamed in the book, describes Jagger as thrilled by Margaret's interest and amused by the elaborate secrecy required to manage it. The detail that has given the story its long half-life is the one involving Bianca Jagger. According to Anderson, Mick told his wife about the affair, and Bianca was furious, not over the infidelity itself, which she had long since stopped expecting to avoid, but over the particular social vanity of it. The implication is that even Bianca recognized what a princess of the blood represented to a man from Dartford, and she resented the calculation more than the act. The trouble with all of this is that Anderson's sources are unnamed. They may have been excellent, they may have been close to the events, but the reader is asked to trust the biographer's judgment of their reliability, and there is no way to test the chain of attribution. This is the structural weakness of the Anderson case, and it is the gap through which Philip Norman drove his counter-argument nearly 20 years later. Norman's 2012 biography of Jagger was the product of long access. He spoke to figures across the inner circle, people who had been at Cheney Walk, people who had been on Mustique, people who had toured with the band and run the household and managed the affairs. He found no first-hand confirmation of an affair with Margaret. He found warmth, social proximity, mutual curiosity, and what he characterized as a flirtation that both parties enjoyed and neither pursued to its conclusion. Norman is not a prudish biographer. His earlier work on the Beatles and on Lennon contains considerable candor about private lives. His reluctance to endorse the Anderson claim is not squeamishness. It is the absence of evidence he was prepared to vouch for. Keith Richards provides a curious data point. In his 2010 memoir, Life, Richards mentions Margaret with affection, describing her as someone Mick courted socially. The phrase is precise and worth dwelling on. courted socially is not the same as slept with, and Richards, whose memoir is famous for its lack of protective discretion about his bandmate, would have had little reason to soften the account if there had been more to tell. Richards spent decades cataloguing what he considered Jagger's vanities and absurdities. The Margaret connection, in his telling, belongs to the social ambition column rather than the romantic one. That is suggestive, though not conclusive. Richards was not in every room. A third strand of evidence comes from Margaret's own correspondence, portions of which were released to biographers after her death in February 2002. Jagger's first name appears on a handful of occasions, always in social contexts. A concert mentioned in passing, a dinner referenced as having occurred, a Mustique sighting noted in the way one notes the weather. Nothing in her own hands suggests intimacy, but Margaret was a careful correspondent, and she had reason to be. She had been burned by the Townsend affair in the 1950s, when private letters became matters of cabinet discussion. She had been burned by Snowden, whose photographer's instinct for documentation extended into the marriage itself. She had been burned by the Llewellyn exposure of February 1976, when a long lens on a Mustique beach turned a private holiday into a tabloid front page. By the time the Jagger question arose, Margaret did not commit secrets to paper. The absence of written evidence proves nothing in either direction. It proves only that she had learned. There is a sympathetic context that needs stating because it affects how the rumour itself functioned in her life. By the mid-1970s, Margaret was a figure of considerable public ridicule. The British press treated her as dissolute, idle and ageing. The photographs from Mustique had reframed her in the public mind as a woman of appetite and indiscretion, and the divorce from Snowden, finalised in 1978, was widely reported as her failure rather than his. In that climate, a connection to Mick Jagger, never confirmed and never denied, performed a particular function. It kept her dangerous. It preserved a version of Princess Margaret that was not yet finished, not yet domesticated by middle age, not yet reduced to the cigarette and the gin and the lonely apartment at Kensington Palace. The rumour, in other words, may have served her. Whether or not she had cultivated it, she had no reason to dispel it. The view from the other side of the supposed liaison is equally telling. For Jagger, born in Dartford in July 1943 to a physical education teacher and a hairdresser, the British aristocracy represented a particular kind of summit. Christopher Sandford's biography, Mick Jagger, Rebel Knight, documents Jagger's lifelong fascination with the upper class, his careful study of its manners, his pleasure in its rituals. The trajectory of his social life moved steadily upward across the decades, from the bohemian Chelsea of the 1960s through the country house weekends of the 1970s and 1980s, and culminated, in 2003, in the knighthood conferred at Buckingham Palace. The arc that had begun with the Redlands drug bust in February 1967, when Jagger had stood in the dock as a symbol of everything respectable England feared, ended 36 years later with him kneeling before the same establishment to receive its honour. A princess in the middle of that journey was not an accidental presence. Whether or not anything specific occurred between them, the proximity itself fitted a pattern. There is one more anecdote that needs to be set down carefully, because it comes from the most reliable witness any of these accounts can claim. Anne Glenconner, who served as Margaret's lady-in-waiting, and whose 2019 memoir, Lady in Waiting, recounts decades at the princess's side, describes a Mustique evening in the mid-1970s. Jagger was at Les Jolies Hauts. He played guitar on the terrace. Margaret listened. The staff were sent away early. Glenconner places herself in the scene up to that point and then stops. she does not say what happened next. She writes that Margaret would never have told her and that she would never have asked. It is the most honest sentence written about the whole affair. It establishes the proximity. It establishes the privacy. It refuses to fill the silence with speculation, and in doing so, it honors both the friendship and the fact that some things, between two adults on a Caribbean terrace late at night, are not the business of biographers or readers. That sentence also marks the practical limit of what can be known. Beyond it lies a closed door that no surviving witness has chosen to open. The staff who were sent away cannot testify to what they did not see. The biographers can quote their unnamed sources and weigh their probabilities, but they cannot place themselves on the terrace. Margaret took whatever happened, or whatever did not happen, with her when she died at Kensington Palace on the 9th of February 2002, at the age of 71. Jagger, still living, has never addressed the question publicly, and at this distance there is no reason to expect that he will. The truth of what passed between them was protected by the only two people who could confirm it, and both are now beyond reach. Margaret in February 2002, the question still open. Jagger still silent. The biographers still arguing over an answer that the principals decided decades ago did not belong to anyone else. The truth of what passed between them was protected by the only two people who could confirm it, and both are now beyond the reach of any biographer's question. Margaret died in February 2002, the matter still open. Jagger remains alive, remains silent, and the books continue to argue across him. So it is worth pausing, before the story closes, to set down precisely what the evidence permits us to say and what it does not. It is documented that Princess Margaret and Mick Jagger knew one another over a span of roughly 15 years, from the late 1960s through to the early 1980s. It is documented that they socialized in London, in New York, and on Mustique. It is documented that Lord Snowdon photographed Jagger before the friendship between Margaret and the singer ever became a matter of speculation. It is documented that they were guests at the same dinners on Cheyne Walk, the same parties at Colin Tennant's house, the same late nights at Studio 54. Andy Warhol's diaries, published in 1989, placed them in the same New York rooms in 1977 and 1978. None of this is in dispute. It is also documented that one major biographer, Christopher Anderson, writing in 1993, asserts on unnamed sources that the friendship was sexual. And it is documented that another biographer, Philip Norman, writing in 2012, with broader access to Jagger's inner circle, examined the same archive and concluded that it was not. Beyond those two contradictory readings, what remains is rumour, atmosphere, and the very deliberate silence of two extraordinarily self-possessed people. That silence is itself the most revealing fact in the whole story. Consider what Margaret's life had been by the time the Jagger question arose. The Townsend affair, in 1955, had been decided not by Margaret, but by the Cabinet, the Church of England, and the newspapers of the day. Her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960 had been photographed, dissected, and eventually picked apart in public, ending in separation in 1976 and divorce in 1978. Her relationship with Roddy Llewellyn was exposed in February 1976 by a long lens on a Mustique beach. The images sold to the news of the world. The 17-year age gap turned into a national joke. Every romantic decision she had ever made had been made in front of an audience she did not invite. The Jagger question is the only one she ever managed to keep on her own terms. For 26 years, between the first whispered rumor and her death, she neither confirmed nor denied it. She did not write about it. She did not tell her lady-in-waiting. She did not leave a letter to be opened after her death. Anne Glenconner, who was closer to her than almost anyone, wrote that Margaret would never have told her, and that she would never have asked. That sentence, more than any biographer's assertion, is the shape of the thing. Whether the silence concealed an affair, or concealed nothing at all, is, in a sense, the wrong question. The silence itself was the achievement. It was the one piece of her romantic life she successfully withheld from the apparatus that had spent 50 years consuming her. If this account has been useful, subscribing to the channel costs nothing, and there are more stories like this one queued. The bell notification means you will see them when they go up. Return now to where we began. The photograph on Mustique, mid-1970s. Margaret in a caftan, sun-bleached. The cigarette holder at a careful angle. The light behind her flat and white, in the way Caribbean light always is by noon. We began with the rumour that Mick Jagger was on the island that same week, and that the princess had sent a car down to the airstrip to meet him. We end without being able to confirm whether he came to the villa, without knowing what was said on the terrace if he did, without knowing whether the staff were sent away early, as Anne Glenconner suggests they sometimes were on evenings when Jagger played guitar at Les Jolies Eaux. The photograph shows only the princess, alone in the frame, looking at something just past the lens. And perhaps that is the point. The image survives, the context does not. The woman in the caftan kept her own counsel, and the picture cannot be made to speak for her. The gap between image and reality, in Margaret's case, was a gap she learned over decades to manage with a certain cold expertise. She let the public see the wreckage. She let them see the drinking and the cigarettes and the long lunches that ran into longer evenings. She let them see the failed marriage and the younger lover on the beach and the aging that the cameras refused to be kind about. She gave them all of that. She gave them the version of herself that sold newspapers, and she gave it freely because she had no choice. But she kept one room locked. Whatever happened with Mick Jagger lived in that room. Christopher Anderson has tried the door from one side. Philip Norman has tried it from the other. Christopher Sandford has walked around the building. Keith Richards, in his memoir, glanced at the window and looked away. The door has not opened. It will not open now. Jagger, knighted at Buckingham Palace in 2003 by the Prince of Wales, has spent his entire public life as a man who tells the press exactly what he wishes them to know, and not a syllable more. He has never spoken about Margaret beyond polite generalities. He is unlikely to begin. And Margaret, who outlived the height of the scandal by a quarter of a century and had every opportunity to settle the question one way or another, chose instead to let the question stand. That choice deserves to be read as a choice, not as forgetfulness, not as discretion imposed by the palace, not as the residue of a more reticent age. Margaret was capable of indiscretion when she wanted to be. She gossiped. She told stories. She mocked the people she disliked, sometimes within their hearing. She was not a woman who could not speak. She was a woman who, on this one subject, would not. The princess, who had spent her whole life being told what she was by other people, by the cabinet, by the bishops, by the newspapers, by the photographers, by the biographers who began circling her before she was 40, finally got the last word by refusing to say one. That is not nothing. For a woman of her generation, in her position, it may be the closest thing to freedom she ever managed. The only romance Princess Margaret kept entirely her own was the one she may never have had.